Hey there, Lucky from Xano here, and today I'm going to show you how to create your own custom chatbot using OpenAI and Xano. On today's session, we're going to cover and firstly going to dig into the OpenAPI API references. So we're going to explore the how to authenticate the APIs from OpenAI, and they're also going to explore the chat completions endpoint, which is going to allow us to build our chatbot. Once we understand how to use the APIs, we're going to actually connect Xano to OpenAI and begin to pull some data into our Xano instance. And we're then going to store the data that we receive from OpenAI as in our database. So we're going to create a conversations table and a messages table with a relationship, which is going to basically create the structure or the shell for our chatbot, which we'll then be able to use and display on our front end. So getting started, we might begin with the authentication, which is firstly, without providing authentication, we're not going to be able to utilize the OpenAI APIs. So as part of all the requests that go across OpenAI's APIs, we need to include as part of our headers, essentially this authorization bearer. So we'll need to include this in the headers, but I can show you how to do that in just a moment. For today's session, we're going to be using the chat completions endpoint, and let's work through what it's telling us here in this documentation. So we can see as a starting point, we're looking to create a post request to the particular endpoint, which is chat and then completions. We have some options in the body, which is going to be the information that we're passing across to ChatGPT to allow it to then respond based on the information we provided. So first and foremost, we're able to use multiple models that OpenAI has available. And for today's session, we're going to use the model GPT 3.5 Turbo because I haven't yet got access to GPT-4, but hopefully soon. You can see a full list of the models that are compatible with this endpoint if you just click into this link here. We're also going to send through as part of our request body the messages. And the messages is an array which contains all of the messages within a conversation. So different to how we work with the the ChatGPT platform provided by OpenAI, where you just send it one message at a time and then it stores the information for you. As part of using the ChatGPT endpoint, we're actually passing through the entire conversation, every message in an array. And this provides us a lot of benefits because we're actually able to change and construct messages that perhaps the AI didn't actually say, which is a form of fine tuning or training, which can be very useful when it comes to trying to guarantee a specific outcome for the chatbot. So exploring a little bit how the messages array is constructed, we've got firstly a role. And the role is important because this defines what type of or who sent the message. We've got initially our system, and the system is really the first training prompt. So this is what is going to define how the ChatGPT acts and what sort of persona it's going to play. We've then got the user, which is the person that's communicating with the chatbot. This is the messages that they're sending through. And then we have an assistant, which is the responses received from the chatbot. So knowing the roles is important because when we want to display the conversation as part of on our front end later on, we're going to need to know the order to sort these in and in which order or who said it. So user, then the assistant, then the user, then the assistant. Content is actually the prompt or the message that we've either sent or received from the chatbot. So each message contains both a user or the role and then the content, which is actually the prompt that we're using. We do have additional options or parameters that we can send through, including the temperature and some other items. We're going to skip over these just for the moment, as they're not required options, as we can see as defined by here. And what we're going to do is we've got a whole range of shortcuts that allow you to very quickly work with external APIs in Xano. And what's fantastic about the OpenAI documentation is they've got a curl example request here. So what this is basically doing is it's giving us all the information that Xano requires to structure and set up this API request. So all I need to do in order to essentially set up this API in Xano is to copy this request here. And I can now head across and we're going to start working with this completions endpoint in Xano. So today I want to show you how easy it is to set up the entire process. So I'm going to start a fresh workspace here, and I'm just going to get started straight away. So we're going to include a user table, a conversation table, and a messages table, which is basically our conversation is going to be the parent. And for each conversation, there's going to be a whole range of messages that exist within that conversation. So, and I'm going to also allow it to create credit endpoints for me. So straight away, from creating my workspace, I'm going to have the ability to programmatically update my records in my database just from the point of creation. I don't need any of these extensions that are available for this particular scenario, so I'm going to skip this. I do want to have user authentication required, so I'm going to enable the default authentication provided by Xano. I'm going to get started. Now that we've got our workspace set up, we're able to begin constructing the schema, or basically the structure for how we want to display our data in our database. So firstly, I'm going to head to my users table, and I'm going to quickly create a user, which we can use for later on. Super secure password. And I'm now going to set up the schema for my conversation and messages table. And the conversation is going to be our parent. And firstly, we're going to start with just a name. So when it comes to sorting through our different conversations, it'll be easy to determine which one's which. I'm also going to include the model. So what version of ChatGPT we're using for the conversation. And I'm also going to include a table reference. So I'm going to essentially include a reference to the user table so we can know exactly who it is that created this conversation. Now that I've got this created, I'm going to also build the messages table. In our messages table, we're going to need to follow the same structure that we were using before for making the request when we were exploring the API documentations. So firstly, we've got the role, who sent the message. We've got the content that exists within inside that message. We're going to create a new field here called the index. And the index is going to track what part of the conversation we're in. So the first set of messages in the conversation will be 0, and the second set of conversations will be 1, 2, 3, and so on. This will be very handy to allow us to sort our conversation and also to be able to edit messages later on without needing to rely on when a message was created in order to display the messages in the correct order. We're also going to need to reference our conversation because the conversation is all these messages is going to be contained within a conversation. So we need a relationship to be able to group these together. That's all we really require initially to be able to set this up. And what we're going to do now is we're going to quickly just view our relationships. So we can see that a conversation is owned by a user. That's the person who created the conversation. And our message is now linked to a conversation because a conversation can contain multiple messages. So what we're going to do is we're now going to set up the APIs. And the reason we're going to set up an API for this is we want to ensure that we can create a conversation via an external system because we want to connect this to our front end. So APIs is the way that external systems can communicate with Xano. I'm going to create a new group called Chatbot. And to make things simple to start with, I'm going to begin just with a start conversation endpoint, which is going to create a new conversation that we can use. First thing I want to do is really understand how to connect with OpenAI. So I want to do this by firstly doing an external API request just to make sure I can get some data across from OpenAI. How I'm going to do this though is I could manually add all this information, but like I showed you before in the API reference, we're able to copy this curl here, and I'm able to paste this directly into this page here. Import. You'll see now that what we have is the URL for the endpoint has been added, chat completions as seen before. We've also got the method, so we're posting, which is perfect. And in our body, it's created the object, and it's also added within the object the parameters we require. So we've got the model being GPT 3.5 Turbo, and we've got an array by the path messages, which we're adding our first message within our chat, which for this particular scenario, we're using the role. And because this is the first message, we actually want to update this to be the system prompt as opposed to the user's prompt, because a system prompts kind of allow us to train ChatGPT. Now, the content is really the prompt or the initial prompt that we're going to be sending through. And we're going to update this in just a moment to basically be an input so we can dynamically update the prompt based on what the user is sending from the front end. Importantly, though, we have down the bottom here in our headers as required for authentication. You can see we've got this authorization bearer, but with the OpenAI key here yet to be updated. Now, heading back across to OpenAI, we're able to get our API key by making sure we're logged in and then heading to View API Keys in the menu. And we're going to create a new secret key here. We're going to call it Chatbot. I want to store this securely in Xano. So how we can do this is we can head to our settings section in Xano, and we're going to create an environment variable. So essentially in here, we can give a name for the variable. We're going to paste in this secret key we've received. And one of the benefits of being able to storing a API key in a system variable is it's done securely, but it also means that if we need to revoke this key for any reason, anywhere that in the system that we've referenced this environment variable will then be updated when we update the key as well. So instead of having to access each function or each API, we can do it securely, or we can update it in one single spot to then have it update across the entire application. So saving this, I'm going to head back to our request. And because we've now got our API key available, we can update this item just here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of our filters, which is the replace filter. And I'm going to search for the token given by API, OpenAI. I'm going to replace this with our key that we've stored as an environment variable. And we can see it's an environment variable based on this item here. So if I update this and I save this function, we can now see that as a result, I'm going to be returning this API 1 response. So if we run this, fingers crossed, this is our initial request we've sent through. We've now got the response, a result, fantastic. And importantly, in our choices section here, we've got a response from the assistant saying, hello, how may I assist you today? So fantastic. We've now got our chatbot initially set up and ready to start manipulating this data. So of course, every time we send a request through, we don't want to just say hello to the chatbot. We want to be able to program it with the prompt from our front end. How we're going to do that is we're going to use inputs. And inputs are the way that you can basically pass information through from another system. So for starters, I'm going to have the prompt or the message, we might call it, that we're receiving from our front end. And because this is our start conversation, in our conversations table, we also had a name. So I'm going to give it an option to create a name for the chat as well. Now that we've got this set up, we can begin to create the logic that's going to allow us to update and store this information. What we can do is, firstly, I want to make sure that I'm working with the information that I need within the API, because if we run this again, we're going to see that there's a lot of information that gets returned as a response from our APIs. And not always do we want to use all this information. I want it to be able to essentially tell me just what the response is from the choices section. So how I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to copy the entire result of API 1. And we've got this really cool function, which is called our subpath functionality, which I can reference the variable API 1. I can use the subpath and I can paste this in, which is going to allow me to navigate through the response received and select the exact pathway to the information that I want. And here I actually want choices, and I want the message, which is the object that's containing the response or the who responded, and then the message received from the chatbot. So if we click on that item, it's now formatted this for us, containing all the dot notation required to get us just the result. So if I unhide this, and I want this to be API result or response specifically. So if I update now my response to only show just the response I want to see, if I run this again, you'll see that we're only now receiving the information that we want. And we can now use this variable and we can start to store this information inside of our database. So there's two components of what we're going to need to store. We're going to need to store the initial message that we've sent through, which in this case is hello, then also the response that we've received from the chatbot as well. What we can do now is we can firstly start adding some information to our database. So a database request, and I want to add a record to my messages table. And in here, we've got a whole range of options. So we've got the role, we've got the content, we've got the index. And because this is the very first message that we're sending through, I'm going to hard code what this is into here. So we're going to say that for this first add record, it's always going to be a system prompt because it's the very first message we're sending through. Now the content here is actually what we want to link to is the message, because this is going to be the message sent through from the user. Now index, we know because this is the very first set of messages that we're sending through, the index in this circumstance is going to be 0. So it's the first message within our conversation. And as we're yet to actually have a conversation, how can we make sure that this message is actually linked to a conversation? So what this lets me know is that we've gone too far already. We need to actually add a conversation. So I'm going to add a record to the conversations table. Like this, we need to fill out the information. So firstly, the name, it's automatically matched to the input that we've had added because we've used the same name that's expected in this table. So our input matches and it's automatically matched those up together. So I don't need to update this one. Our model, for now, we can also hard code this item in here as well because we know that we're using the particular model, which we can actually copy straight from OpenAI. So if we head back to the reference and we go to chat, you know, the exact model we're using is GPT 3.5 Turbo. So I'm going to paste this in here as well. And then the user ID is something we haven't yet got set up. But what we can do is we can add authentication requirements to this endpoint. So this little icon at the top here, what we can do is we can click on this and we can enable authentication by user authentication. I can save this item. So what this now means is that as you'll see here and I run into bug, we've now got an option to add an auth token to our requests and I can select a user. So we're going to use Lachlan as the user moving forward. And what this also provides us is the ability for us to include the user via their ID. And how we access that is we've got a particular field here where it says auth, and you'll see within auth should have access to our auth ID. So we'll get that in just a second. I've deleted that and it's now showing me the auth ID. And what happens as part of the auth exchange is each time we receive a token, Xano automatically converts that authentication token into the user. And we can then reference that user ID to populate our tables. And in this instance, we can have it populate the user ID so we know who created the conversation. As our function begins to run, our API request is going to run first, and we're going to be able to use this output variable, which is the API1. So using this, we can then reference API1 further down our function stack. The same thing is true for our conversation table. Because we're going to be adding a record here, we actually are going to receive an output from this action, and the action is going to be the record that's actually being created as part of that, which is fantastic because if we need to know what the conversation ID is, this now exists within the ID variable, but that ID lives inside of conversation 1. So how we can reference that is inside of our add record step to our messages, we can reference conversation 1, but we can do .id because we know that that's the path of the ID that we're receiving from our conversation variable here. So what we're doing is we're receiving the response. We're now creating a conversation, which will be the parent item. And for our first message, we're now adding this to our messages table. We're making sure that we've got a reference to the parent object, which is fantastic. And we also now need to not just provide the initial system prompt, which is getting defined by the user. We also want to make sure we're adding the response that we're receiving from the chatbot as well as an additional message. So how we can do that is, again, just another add record. But instead, This time we're going to have the role be the API response dot role, and the content is going to be the same, API response, but dot content, because we've copied the same key names that OpenAI has been using. And also because this is our first conversation or set of messages, and for each set of messages is basically the user says something and then the chatbot responds, that's a count of one or an index. So still within our first set of messages, we're going to set index 0 for this particular one as well. And we can actually reference the exact same ID as we did prior because we want this to relate to the same conversation. So we're now almost set up to create a conversation and all the messages that relate to this conversation, except we didn't update before the input that we're receiving from the user. Instead, this is still programmed to just say hello each time. So this one here, we want to make sure we update to the input of, which we can find through the input tab here. If I delete these items here, we can see that we want to include the message that's received from the user. If we run into bug, you'll see because we added these inputs earlier, we've now got the option to add information to our API request. And a message is going to be, you are a chatbot designed to help me build chatbots with Xano. And the conversation, the name, we're just going to say is a chatbot helper. Building helper might be better for that one. And fingers crossed, if this runs, everything will work. But let's have a look and see how we go. So we've got a success statement here, but what does that mean? So our success statement is basically only returning the API response here. We can get further information about what's happening here via our debugger. And we can see it's done the external API request. It's created the variable API response. We've added a record to our conversation, which it successfully added the record here. We can also now see that it's also added the messages and it's related it to conversation ID 2. Also got the final message added as well. So if we now go to our database, we can have a look at our conversation. We have conversation 1 here, which is the successful response. We also have in our messages table the 2 messages at index 0 with a relationship to our conversation ID. So everything is now set up for our first conversation. And we can now build another API that's going to allow us to continue a conversation. And we're going to need to actually adjust how that works a little bit this time, because instead of creating just a single message array, we're going to need to basically get the data from our database first, which is all the previous messages. We're going to have to construct a custom array which will allow us to feed all that conversation history across into our request. So we're going to add some inputs that are different to this endpoint, and it's going to be the conversation ID, as we've now created a conversation. And we still need to know what information we're getting sent through from the front end. So we're going to include another input here for messages because we want to be able to allow the user to also send through a new message to add to the conversation. Now, as mentioned, how we need to send information across to ChatGPT is we need to provide an entire list of all the messages and all the conversation history to as part of our request to OpenAI. So to first do that, we need to query all our records in our messages table because we want to get all the messages that exist against the conversation. So we can create a custom query where the conversation ID is equal to the input that we've received from our front end. And now this will only return the related messages, which if we include which conversation IDs we're using, conversation ID 2, we can see we've got both messages from that we created earlier. Now, the issue we have here, though, is we don't know how to control which order these messages come in. And that's why we included the index earlier. because we want to create custom sorting on how these messages get displayed. So to do this, we're going to sort first by the index. And we want the index to operate in an ascending order, so from 0 upwards. But we also need another sort here, which is by the role. And for the role, we want to do it based on descending. And the reason for that is both a system prompt and a user prompt are essentially the first messages that get sent through. And the last message that's received is always via the assistant. And because the assistant starts with letter A, we're able to basically descend the order it sorts the roles in. So it's always going to first place within each index the system prompt or the user prompt prior to the, it's always going to pass through the system prompt or the user prompt prior to the assistant prompt. So it's going to essentially sort these in the correct order. So if I run this, there's no change currently, but we've got this in the correct order. So the system prompt is coming through first, and then the assistant or the response you've received is now coming through secondary. And that's important because what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be constructing an entire array, which is going to allow us to pass all that information across in one item to ChatGPT. Now, importantly, because we're actually counting the index in this circumstance, we need to firstly identify from our response you've received, messages 1, we need to know what the last item is that we've actually received is from that array. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to add a new variable called index count. What we're going to get here is we're going to return from messages 1, we want to add the last item that exists within this. And I actually want to get from this item, I want to get the index that exists inside of this item, because we want to know what the last message was and what the index value was. But in addition to that, for this particular one, we know that it's index 0. So we want to just add it. So the next conversation that we add will be index 1. So we can use an add filter and just simply add an additional item onto this. So if we use our stop and debug function in our utility functions here, we can do exactly that just to check. So we can check our index count, and hopefully this should be a value of 1. Fantastic. So our index count is working. The purpose of this is, like I said, we'll be able to make sure that the next messages we add through use the next value within the index as opposed to 0. So next, we need to construct an array, which is going to contain all the messages that we've just gathered from our database. And how we're going to do this is it's in 2 parts. So firstly, we're going to create the variable, which is the array. So this is the messages array. And this is ultimately what we're wanting to send through to ChatGPT. We want to make sure that it is the correct value type, an array. I'm going to save this. Now, whenever we start to work with lists of multiple items, we need to make sure that we utilize loops, as that's how we can access each individual message and then do something with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a for each loop, because I want to run through all the messages that are related to this conversation. And once we selected this, I'm going to reference the message 1, which is the list of all the messages we've received. I can just call this the message. Now, for each message, what we need to do is we need to basically remember that initial structure that we created for, and inside of here, we're going to actually construct our own custom object, because we need to add to it exactly what the role and the message is for each message inside of the conversation. So now that we've created our object, we have these filters here where we can quickly add set and get. This is allowing me to create a key value pair within an object. So firstly, we want to create role. What this is actually going to be is it's going to be the individual message, which is the variable, not the input. So we've created a message here. And what I want this item to be is it's the message.role, because we're referencing the role item within the individual message. And we also want to do the same for the content, because we want the content to match what it is inside there as well. So path, content. And then this is going to be, again, our variable, the single message. And this is going to be the content. We save this. So again, good habit to get into when you're working through functions is to be able to stop and debug and just make sure that the message structure we've created is exactly how we want it to be. So I'm going to add a stop and debug after our first loop or our first message to make sure that this output's going to be correct. So run this, we can see we've now created our own custom object, which has got role, and it's got the content from that message. And because we want to construct an array that contains all the messages with just these items, I actually want to add this item to my messages array I've created here. So how I'm going to do that is we have a particular function for arrays where I can add to the end of the array. The existing variable is going to be the messages, which is the overall array we want to structure. And we want to just add in the individual message structure that we've created. So what that means is for each time we loop through one of the messages, it's going to add each message into our array. And then we'll be able to reference this array to send through the entire conversation in one go. We need to also make sure that we add on to that our current message that we're wanting to send through to ChatGPT as well. So not just the existing conversation, our new message that needs to get added to it as well. So this can be our new message that we're looking to send through. And this one, actually, we need to create a custom object again as well. So for this, we can set the role to be the user, and it's the user prompt that we're receiving. And we can also set the content, but this time we want to make sure the content is the input that we're receiving from our front end, which I'm referencing here as the input. So what we've now done is we've now created another object, just like we have here, except it's updated with the most recent information that we've just sent through from our front end. So we need to do the same thing again. Because we want to send the entire information through in one array, I can also add this one to the end of the array after all the previous messages have been added. And that's why we've added it outside of this loop. So the existing variable was the messages array. And this time we're adding the new message onto it. We should now be able to stop and debug afterwards. And we can now check what our messages array is. So if we run this, we've now got message, which contains initial conversation, the system prompt, the response, and our new message our user's now sending. And because we didn't include any content, geez, input here, we'll see we've now returned the entire conversation, including the new message, which is fantastic because we now have the array that we require to send through to OpenAI. So just like before, we need to do an external API request again, and we need to send through this information. So just like before, we can use some shortcuts. We can copy the curl, import this, and this time we want to update our messages entire array to the message we've created. So all of these functions here are irrelevant because we've already created the entire array here. So that's updated. We've now got our content we're sending through sorted. And again, we have to also update the token here. So if we copy this item, we add our replace filter back onto this, add in an environment variable being the OpenAI key. So we've now got our API request set up. And just like before, let's test to make sure that things are working correctly. So API 1, save this, and let's see what we're getting back as a response from the request. Hopefully now, if we update our input, what are some steps to create a chatbot? And we need to make sure, again, we're referencing conversation ID 2. And there has been some latency issues or some response time issues with ChatGPT. So sometimes it can take longer than others to get a response. So this is fantastic. We can now utilize this response to essentially set up our add the additional messages to our messages table. So just like last time, I want to know exactly this bit of information here that I'm trying to receive. So I can actually copy this API1 request again. And we want this to be the API result. We can call it the data that we want to receive. And I want to reference the API1 variable, the result again from this response. And using the subpath filter, I'm able to define and navigate again straight to the path of where the response is. So this is under choices, and the messages object is what we're wanting to return just again. So now that we've got the data to add to our databases, it's just a matter of then adding the records. The first message we're going to add is our user, the input we're receiving from our front end, and the content we're going to receive is their input as well. So just the messages that we've received. The index is going to be the count that we've created. So this is going to be for this set of messages. It'll be the last message's index plus 1, so 1 in this instance. And then the conversation ID, which is what we're passing through, again, also as an input. So we don't need to query our conversations table here because we know which conversation we're currently working with. Now that we've added the user's response, we can change this output to the user. We can add another record. And this one's going to be the assistant's output. So now that we've got our content or the result data, we know that within that object which we selected, there was a key value pair of a role was the key and the value being the role of the assistant. The content, it's the same. So we do the data that we've created, the object we've created, dot content, which is the path within that object that we're trying to access. And the index, again, will be the index count. So now that we've got this set up, we should be all right to add these items to our database. And if I remove this stop and debug, I can hide it for now. I don't want to return a response just yet. And if we run this, assuming we don't run into any errors with OpenAI, success. We've now received a successful result. We can check in our debugger. We can see the request has been processed, and we've added records to both of our tables. Now, you'll see here that there's actually 3 sets of messages. Reason being is I was testing offline because OpenAI wasn't working. So I accidentally added a additional set of messages. But we can see here now that it's basically the index count is working correctly. So we've got our first set of messages, a second set of messages, and our third set of messages. And really, the basic setup for our chatbot is now ready to go. We can start a conversation and we continue a conversation. Now, that's all good and well, but how do you then display this information on your front end? And as a very quick example of how we could now display these tables we've created, we could create some more APIs as well. So in our chatbot, we might start firstly just with the conversations. So there might be a list of conversations, and you want your user to be able to select which conversation they'd like to enter. And we can do this with a query to our conversations table. We want to get all the conversations that are related to the user. So we need to add authentication to this endpoint again. And this is going to give us the auth ID of the user making the request. And we can then query only the messages or the conversations, sorry, that are related to the user. So our auth ID. And because I've only created one conversation, we should get one response back for the user, Lachlan. There we go. We've now got our chat, our first conversation there. Now, if we wanted to, say we've only got a few conversations and you're wanting to be able to access these messages immediately from one API call, what we could do is we could add on here our messages. So messages, we want to return a list of items because we can have many messages within a conversation. And we have the conversation ID as our reference ID. So if we set up this, we've now added on our messages. And if we save this, we run it again, we now have the conversation and all the messages that are associated to the item. However, when it comes to displaying these items, we might actually, you can see here that these are displayed in the incorrect order. So we've got user, system, assistant, assistant, and assistants responded twice in a row. So what we can also do, when you're actually wanting to view the conversation, we might have a separate API endpoint, which is allowing you to just pull in the messages specific to a conversation. So we could do a get to our messages table. And this time we want to query all records based on a conversation ID that we create. So with this one, we're going to first set the query to be only return messages that relate to the conversation ID. This will be the input. And if we save, we're going to get back all those messages now. But what we want to do as well is we want to make sure that these are coming through in the correct order as well. So again, we've got two assistants in a row, which just doesn't work. It's not going to be a logical order that we can follow. So again, why we created our sorting earlier is so we can sort first by the index, so from 0 going upwards, and then we can also then sort by the role. So we know that the conversation should be happening from a user, then an assistant, and backwards and forwards. So if we save the sorting, we now got system, assistant, user, assistant, user, assistant. So our first message, then to our last or most recent message, it's now sorted in the correct order. So when you're displaying this on your front end, it's now going to be a logical order for your users to follow. So at a very high level, that's the bare bones of what you need to do to get started building your own chatbot. And what features you want to add from there, it's completely up to you. But if you have any additional things you'd like me to cover, please feel free to leave me a message inside of the comments. And look forward to going through this in the next video with you again on another AI project coming soon. But speak to you all soon. Thanks for watching.